Welcome to the deep dive. Ever wonder how your body manages all those complex things automatically, like without you even lifting a finger?
It's pretty amazing when you stop to think about it.
Totally. So today we're taking a deep dive into those invisible forces, specifically the autonomic nervous system. Your body's personal autopilot.
That's right. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a bit of material research, articles, our notes, all looking at how our bodies run on autopilot.
And also those communication pathways in the nervous system.
Exactly. And that incredible barrier that protects your brain. Really crucial stuff.
Right. So our mission today is simple. Cut through the jargon, pull out the key insights, and help you get up to speed on these, well, fundamental biological processes.
And hopefully uncover some surprising facts along the way. It's genuinely fascinating.
Okay, let's get into it then. This whole system managing things like breathing, heartbeat, digestion, completely unconsciously, that's the autonomic nervous system, the ANS.
Yes, the ANS, it handles all those involuntary processes. Things you really wouldn't want to have to consciously manage, believe me.
Like breathing. Or your heart beating.
Precisely. Or even, urine production. The ANS keeps it all ticking over smoothly in the background.
And within this system, I understand there are two main branches, almost like opposing forces.
That's a great way to put it. You have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. They often work in opposition, but it's more like a complementary balance, a biological push and pull.
Okay, so sympathetic, that's the famous one.
The fight or flight response, it generally kicks in when you're active, stressed, maybe facing a threat, gets you ready for action.
And parasympathetic.
That's your rest and digest mode. It's dominant when you're relaxed, recovering, digesting a meal. Sort of the calming influence.
And how do the signals actually get from, say, the brain to an organ?
Well, generally it's a two-neuron chain. Think of it like a relay race. The first neuron starts in the central nervous system, the brain or spinal cord. It runs to a cluster of nerve cells called an autonomic ganglion. That's the relay station. Then a second neuron picks up the signal and carries it the rest of the way to the target tissue or organ.
Got it. 2 steps. Now, this is where I find it gets really interesting. The chemicals involved, the neurotransmitters. How does the body actually send the message?
Ah, yes, the chemical language. It's quite elegant. Let's compare it quickly to voluntary movement first. Okay.
Sure.
When you decide to move, say, your arm, that's the somatic nervous system, it uses just one neuron straight from the CNS to your skeletal muscle.
Simple.
Right. And it releases a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, or ACH, that directly tells the muscle to contract. Very straightforward, always excitatory.
Okay, but the autonomic system is more complex.
Much more nuanced, yes. Let's take the sympathetic system again. That first neuron, the pre-ganglionic one, it releases acetylcholine, ACH, at that relay station, the ganglion.
Okay, same chemical so far.
Right. But the second neuron, the post-ganglionic one, that goes to the target organ, like a blood vessel, it primarily releases a different chemical, norepinephrine, or NE.
So a different messenger for the final step.
Exactly. And here's the twist. Depending on where that norepinephrine lands, on which specific receptor on the target organ, it can either stimulate activity or inhibit it.
So the same chemical can give opposite instructions. Wow.
It depends entirely on the receiving end, the receptor type. And there's a special case, too. The sympathetic system has a direct line to your adrenal glands, sitting on top of your kidneys.
The adrenaline ones.
Precisely. When acetylcholine hits the adrenal medulla, it doesn't release norepinephrine onto another neuron. Instead, it causes the adrenal gland itself to dump epinephrine, which is adrenaline, and also some norepinephrine directly into your bloodstream.
So that's the adrenaline rush. It bypasses the second neuron and goes straight into the blood.
You got it. A system-wide alert.
Okay. Now, what about the parasympathetic side? The rest and digest. How does its messaging work?
Similar start. The first, pre-ganglionic neuron, also releases acetylcholine, ACH, at its ganglion.
Okay, ACH again at the first stop.
But here's the key difference for the parasympathetic system. The second neuron, the post-ganglionic one, going to places like your gut or your heart muscle, it also primarily releases acetylcholine.
Wait, so ACH at both steps for parasympathetic?
Mostly, yes. It acts on different types of receptors at the target organ, usually muscarinic receptors compared to the nicotinic receptors at the ganglion. And again, depending on the specific receptor and organ, this ACH can be either excitatory or inhibitory.
So acetylcholine does double duty. It's used by both systems at the first step, And then it's the main messenger for the second step in the parasympathetic system. That's intricate.
It really is. It highlights how the location and the specific receptor are just as important as the chemical messenger itself. It allows for incredibly fine-tuned control across the body.
Okay, so we have these two systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic, often pushing and pulling against each other. Let's talk about what that actually looks like in specific organs. How does this play out?
Great idea. It's a constant balancing act. Let's take your eyes, for instance. When your sympathetic system kicks in, maybe you're startled, your pupils dilate, get bigger. That's called mydriasis. Lets more light in, helps you see potential threats.
Right, like wide-eyed fear.
Exactly. But when you're relaxed, reading a book, your parasympathetic system takes over, and your pupils constrict, get smaller. That's meiosis. Helps you focus up close.
Okay, opposite effects. What about tears or saliva?
Good examples. Your tear glands, the lacrimal glands. The sympathetic system doesn't do much there, but the parasympathetic system stimulates them quite strongly, think. Emotional crying or irritation, lots of tears.
Makes sense.
And saliva. Sympathetic activation leads to that classic dry mouth feeling. It constricts blood vessels in the glands and produces just a tiny amount of thick, viscous saliva.
Ugh, yeah, I know that feeling during public speaking.
Right. But the parasympathetic system does the opposite. It increases blood flow, vasodilation, and stimulates loads of watery fluid saliva, perfect for starting digestion.
Fascinating. What about things like sweat or goosebumps?
Sweat glands are interesting. They're primarily activated by the sympathetic system, leading to sweating. But here's a quirk. The sympathetic nerves going to most sweat glands actually release acetylcholine, not norepinephrine. It's an exception.
Oh, okay. So sympathetic control, but using the parasympathetic chemical?
For most sweat glands, yes, it's cholinergic sympathetic innervation. The parasympathetic system, though, generally has no effect on sweat glands. And those goosebumps, that's purely sympathetic. Tiny muscles attached to your hair follicles contract hair erection. Parasympathetic doesn't touch those.
Wow. So it's not always a perfect opposition. Sometimes one system dominates entirely. What about the really core stuff, like heart and lungs?
Absolutely crucial. For the heart, sympathetic activation speeds up your heart rate and actually dilates the coronary arteries, the ones supplying blood to the heart muscle itself. More fuel for the pump during stress.
Okay, faster beat, more blood flow to the heart muscle.
Correct. Parasympathetic does the opposite. Slows the heart rate down and constricts the coronary arteries slightly, conserving energy when you're at rest.
And the lungs. Breathing.
Sympathetic activation causes bronchodilation. Your airways open up wider, letting you take in more oxygen. Think gasping for air when running.
Makes sense.
Parasympathetic causes bronchoconstriction airways narrow slightly, part of the resting state.
What about digestion? I know fight or flight isn't great for eating.
You got it. Sympathetic activation puts the brakes on digestion. It decreases peristalsis, the muscular contractions that move food along, and reduces digestive secretions. Your body's saying, no time to digest, we need energy elsewhere.
Right.
Parasympathetic, the rest and digest system, does the opposite. It ramps up peristalsis and secretion, gets that food processing efficiently.
Incredible coordination. Let's touch on a couple more, maybe the bladder and sexual function.
Sure. For the bladder, the sympathetic system has a more complex role in storage, but the parasympathetic system is the primary driver for emptying. It causes the muscular wall of the bladder to contract, promoting urination.
Okay.
And in male sexual function, it's a classic example of coordination. The parasympathetic system is primarily responsible for vasodilation, leading to erection. The sympathetic system then takes over for ejaculation, involving vasoconstriction and smooth muscle contraction.
So both systems are involved, but at different stages.
Exactly. It showcases how they can work sequentially or cooperatively, not just in opposition.
So summing this part up, what this means for you, the listener, is that your body is performing this constant, automatic, incredibly complex balancing act every second, adjusting to everything inside and out.
Without you needing to give it a single thought. It's just this silent, highly efficient internal management system.
Odd.
Truly remarkable engineering.
Absolutely. Okay, we've seen the big picture of organ control, but you mentioned how the messages get passed. Let's zoom in on that junction point, the synapse.
Yes, the synapse. It's fundamental. Think of it as the microscopic communication hub. It's the specialized gap, or junction, where information gets transmitted from one neuron to the next, or from a neuron to an effector cell, like a muscle cell or a gland cell.
A handover point.
Precisely. And a key feature is unidirectional conduction. The signal almost always travels in just one direction across the synapse, from the sender to the receiver.
How does that happen? What crosses the gap?
It starts with the arrival of an electrical signal at the end of the sending neuron, the presynaptic neuron. This triggers the release of chemical messengers, the neurotransmitters we talked about, like ACH or NE, into that tiny gap.
Okay, the chemicals are released.
Then, those neurotransmitter molecules float across the gap and bind to specific receptor proteins embedded in the membrane of the receiving neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, like a key fitting into a lock.
And that binding does.
That binding event triggers a response in the postsynaptic neuron. It can either excite it, making it more likely to fire its own signal, or inhibit it, making it less likely to fire.
So it's a chemical signal turning into an electrical or inhibitory response in the next cell.
You've got it. That's the essence of synaptic transmission. And when you scale this up, especially in the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, the complexity is just staggering.
How so?
Well, it's not just simple chains. Some single neurons in the CNS can form synapses with literally hundreds of thousands of other neurons. Imagine the sheer density of connections, the network. It's beyond intricate.
Mind-boggling. Okay, so signals are zipping around within this network. But how does the brain protect itself from unwanted stuff getting in for the bloodstream in the first place? Let's talk about that barrier.
Ah, yes, the blood-brain barrier, or BBB. This is absolutely critical. It's like the brain's highly selective gatekeeper.
How is it different from blood vessels elsewhere?
Well, in most of your body, the tiny blood vessels, the capillaries, are somewhat leaky. The cells forming the vessel walls, endothelial cells, have small gaps between them, fenestrations, and they use tiny internal bubbles, vesicles, to shuttle fluids and molecules across. Things can move in and out relatively freely.
Okay, fairly open access.
But in the brain and spinal cord, it's a completely different story. Those endothelial cells are fused together by incredibly tight junctions. Think of it like seamless welding between the cells. No gaps.
Like a sealed pipe.
Exactly. Plus, these cells have far fewer of those transport vesicles, and they're surrounded by other specialized cells, parasites, and projections from astrocytes, a type of glial cell. It forms a multi-layered, highly restrictive barrier.
So what does this barrier actually do? What does it block?
Its main job is to protect the brain's very stable environment from fluctuations in the blood and to keep out potentially harmful substances like toxins or pathogens. Generally, it excludes large molecules and things that dissolve well in water hydrophilic substances.
Water-loving stuff stays out. What gets in?
Things that dissolve well in fats or lipids, lipophilic substances. This includes essential gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, which can just diffuse easily across the fatty cell membranes of the barrier.
Makes sense. The brain needs O2 constantly. How do we measure this fat-loving property?
Scientists use a measure called the oil-water partition coefficient. Basically, it tells you how readily a substance dissolves in oil compared to water. A higher coefficient means it's more lipophilic, more fat-loving.
And that means?
That means it can generally cross the blood-brain barrier much more easily by simple diffusion. Substances with a high partition coefficient have a much better chance of getting into the brain.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Our sources highlight things like nicotine, diazepam, which is the active ingredient in Valium heroin, ethanol, which is alcohol.
Ah, that explains why they have such rapid effects on the brain.
Precisely. They have high oil-water partition coefficients, so they sleep through that barrier relatively easily. Another example mentioned is the antibiotic chloramphenicol.
Okay. What about things that don't get in easily?
Things with low partition coefficients, meaning they're more water-soluble, have a much harder time. Examples include the chemotherapy drug methotrexate, a sugar alcohol called mannitol, sodium ions, the antibiotic penicillin.
Penicillin doesn't cross well. That's important for treating brain infections.
It is. And also things like morphine and dopamine, they have lower coefficients and relatively poor penetration into the brain through simple diffusion.
But wait, the brain needs fuel, right?
Yeah.
Glucose is a sugar, presumably water-soluble. And didn't we talk about L-DOP for Parkinson's? How do they get in?
Excellent point. That shows the barrier isn't just passive diffusion. For essential molecules like glucose and amino acids like L-DOPA, the brain has specific active transport systems. Think of them as dedicated molecular ferry boats or pumps embedded in the barrier cells.
So it actively pulls in the specific things it needs, even if they aren't naturally fat-loving.
Exactly. It's a highly selective and actively managed barrier. It lets in the good stuff via specific transporters while keeping most other things out.
Which must be incredibly important for medicine, right? Trying to design drugs that can cross the barrier to treat brain conditions.
Absolutely critical. Understanding the BBB, its transport mechanisms, and how to potentially bypass or utilize them is a huge area of pharmaceutical research.
Hmm.
Getting drugs effectively into the brain remains a major challenge for treating neurological disorders, infections, or brain tumors.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot. From the body's automatic controls via the ANS,
Either the microscopic messages jumping across synapses.
and finally the brain's incredible protective shield, the blood-brain barrier. It really is an amazing interconnected system.
It is. The way the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems conduct their constant, elegant dance, the sheer precision of synaptic communication, and then the vital guardianship of the BBB. It's all testament to the complexity and, frankly, the beauty of human biology.
It really makes you appreciate the invisible forces at work inside you right now. Okay, to wrap up, here's a final thought for you to mull over.
Uh-huh.
Consider how delicate this all is. What happens if that autonomic balance is just slightly off? Or if the permeability of that blood-brain barrier changes, even subtly? Think about how these tiny shifts, deep inside your biology, could profoundly impact how you feel, how you function, maybe even how you experience the world day to day. How much does this internal autopilot, this gatekeeper, truly shape who we are and how we interact with everything around us? Something to really think about, isn't it? A new appreciation for your own incredible biology.